Thanks very much. Welcome, everybody. I'm Steve Payne. I'm the Dean of the Columbus School of Law at Catholic University of America. Thanks so much for joining us. Really delighted you're with us today. This is the first of our series of online programs on business accountability for human rights. The series consists of 4 online programs on various aspects of business accountability for human rights. And these discussions will culminate in a conference here at the law school in the fall of 2021. Addressing these issues is in their profound impact on human lives in the United States and around the world is a critical part of our mission and who we are as a law school. So we're thrilled to be able to offer this programming. And today's program will offer an overview of human rights issues in global supply chains with a particular focus on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our moderator is Professor Sarah Duggin. Sarah teaches corporate law and constitutional law here at Catholic Law and directs our compliance, investigations, and corporate responsibility program. Sarah, we have wonderful panelists, but Sarah will introduce them, and I'm so glad that they're here with us today. But let me just say too, I'm just so thankful to Professor Duggin for her outstanding work in really building our compliance program, and with the great focus here on human rights and business accountability. I think it's wonderful. So Sarah, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Steve. Really appreciate it. And thanks, just as we begin, I also want to say a quick thanks to the great team who made this program possible and who have worked really hard to support this new compliance, investigations, and corporate responsibility here at Catholic. So thanks to Joan Verassi, our Director of Student Life and Special Events, to Louise Leiden, our Executive Director of Development and Alumni Relations, to Kate Smith, our Director of Alumni Relations, Joe Ferraro, our Director of Marketing and Communications, Al Washington, our Web Content Manager, Research Assistant Daniel Warren, and to Ali Ussery, who works with Kevin Hyland on human rights issues. And of course, the person who's absolutely key here is Emily Sobieski, who's responsible for setting up this webinar, getting in touch with us all, and managing all the technical aspects of this program. Thanks to you all. Today's program, as Dean Payne said, has to do with business accountability for human rights. A recent United Nations report estimates that 40 million people, 29 million of them women and girls, are caught in the chains of modern-day slavery or other aspects of forced or extremely exploitive labor. And a number of these victims are laboring in global supply chains right now. They're harvesting crops, they're mining minerals, and they're assembling products that enrich our lives and the lives of others. The tantalum in your cell phone, the coltan, the mica that makes cosmetics sparkle and new cars shine, these are coming often from workers living on the margins of society who are struggling for a meager sustenance and are often deprived of the most basic freedoms. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the plight of these folks, but it's also provided a new lens into the reality of human rights abuses in global supply chains. So this afternoon, our panelists will offer their insights on business and human rights, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have 2 terrific panelists, Kevin Hyland. Kevin joins us today across the ocean in Ireland with a 5-hour time difference, so we particularly appreciate his being here at this late time. He's a globally recognized expert on modern-day slavery and forced labor, and he has 30 years of experience in law enforcement. Mr. Hyland served as the United Kingdom's first independent anti-slavery commissioner, and he is the author of United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 8.7, which is a call to eradicate modern-day slavery, forced labor, and child labor. He chairs the Institute of Human Rights and Business Responsible Recruitment Group. He's a member of the Council of Europe's group of experts on action against trafficking in human beings, and he's the chief advisor to the Santa Marta Group, a high-level partnership that is among law enforcement agencies and faith groups and civil society that Pope Francis has endorsed. Queen Elizabeth awarded Mr. Hyland the Order of the British Empire for his work. John Durkalski is a 2009 graduate of Catholic Law, and he's a partner in the law firm of Butsavage Durkalski. I think that was 2008, excuse me, a 2008 graduate. And Mr. Durkalski represents labor unions and individuals in labor and employment and political campaign matters, and he is deeply engaged in issues facing our labor force. During this pandemic, he's become involved with issues affecting vulnerable workers in a number of areas, but particularly in the meat and poultry processing companies. Mr. Durkalski has also served as Program and Media Relations Coordinator for the ACLU of Ohio and with the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee Labor Policy Office. Unfortunately, our third panelist, Mark Holden, former Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Koch Industries, had to withdraw from today's program because of a family matter. And we regret that he can't be with us, but we're very fortunate to have even more time to hear from Kevin and John. We're going to begin with an overview for our panelists, probably about 10 minutes each, and then turn to some discussion questions. The final segment of our program will be questions from all of you, and we hope that you will type in your questions so that we'll be able to see them, because in webinar format, we can't actually hear you. So we're going to be using the Q&A tool that's at the bottom of your screen in your toolbar. So if you would just scroll down to the bottom of your screen, you should see a little icon that says Q&A. If you will activate that, then you will be ready to type in your questions as they arise, and we will be seeing them and be able to deal with them either as they arise or more likely at the end of the program. So with that, Kevin, thanks for being here. Would you begin by giving us a brief overview of the current situation with respect to the risk of human rights abuses in global supply chains?
So thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Dean Payne, for the introduction. And thank you for organizing this and for this important subject, particularly at a time of COVID. I'm sharing some screens with you now. I hope they've come through. Have they, Sarah?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So what I want to do is talk about this issue that we talk about, human trafficking and modern slavery, which is a tragic issue, as we know. Let me just share again.
Yeah. We're just waiting for it to come through. There it is.
There we are. Thank you. So as we know, and as you rightly said, this is an issue that affects 40 million people around the world. And there's also 151 million children who are in exploitative labor conditions. So when we're talking about a time when we're seeing COVID, a lot of the issues are now being unraveled and seen more clearly. And very often not because countries or nations or policies are particularly looking at this issue, but because they're looking at the health issues that concern us, the more privileged. And in the UK, for example, there was a big expose of a fashion industry who had hundreds of people for a number of years working in shocking conditions, not being paid properly. And it was because of COVID and the threat they posed to the community that this was exposed. But understanding what trafficking is against smuggling, I'm sure people know the differences, but one is particularly different, and they do get conflated, but they are interchangeable, because somebody who's smuggled can then become trafficked and vice versa. So understanding the crime and what it is, because it is a crime, is crucial. And that is where decision makers are very often at fault, particularly when you look at what's called national referral mechanisms, which should operate across the world proactively to identify victims. But unfortunately, they very rarely work properly, because one is a crime against an individual where they are the commodity and they are exploited at the end of the journey, or at some point they're held against their will to be exploited or coerced. In the other, it is purely about getting through a border in an illegal fashion. Obviously, as we know as well, human trafficking and modern slavery don't actually need a border. It can be internal. But there's lots of legislation. And if we go back, we can see legislation as far back as 326 BC, where there was going to be this commitment to end trafficking or modern slavery or whatever they called it in those days. And hundreds of pieces of commitments and legislation have been developed over the years. And nothing is really different now. We have various pieces of legislation, the Council of Europe Convention, which sets out what a country who's a Council of Europe member should do, the EU directive, the OSCE guidance, which is wider than Europe, includes countries like the USA, the UN agreements, including the SDGs and the Palermo Protocol, supply chain legislation in the UK, in Australia, in France, and your own Tariff Act, human rights measures, including the rights of the child and many of the conventions, and of course, modern slavery and human trafficking legislation, which is almost in every country in the world, certainly all the countries that have signed up to the Palermo Protocol. So we have all this. So why is it the issue is bigger now than it ever was? In the days of the transatlantic slave trade, it was estimated over the 2 centuries, there was about 15 million people who were trafficked or in slavery. It's 40 million today. And even when we take, populations, the change since the 1800s and the explosion that there is now, pro rata, this is a bigger problem now. And it's a real global problem, which perhaps creates some of the changes. Globalization of many things, including business, has forgotten about globalization of human rights and the protection of people. So if we look across the world, these are figures produced by the US State Department Trafficking in Persons Office. And if we think and look at these numbers, 118,000, almost 119,000 victims were identified in 2019. That against 40 million doesn't even equal to 0.5%. And then if we look at convictions against the amount of crimes there are, so at least 40 million crimes, and some people could be offended against more than once, 9,500 convictions, which is almost not measurable. So in effect, 99.98% of the time, you get away with this, and 99.5% of the time, victims aren't identified. So we have to ask, are our current legislations and measures effective, or are they not meeting the challenge, or are they not being implemented properly? So that works out 1 in every 2,150 victims see their perpetrator convicted. Not really a good record. But if we look at the things that we're talking about today, where do we see this crime being committed? Where is it happening? And it's happening in areas, particularly now when we look at COVID, there's a big demand on PPE equipment, protection for medical staff and for all of us. But before COVID, it was identified in Malaysia that factories linked with forced labor were providing to the National Health Service in the UK and to the US and to Australia. So the hands that were saving lives were wearing gloves that were made at the cost of lives and the damage to lives. Also, charity events. The shirts were being made by people in modern slavery. So we need to be aware of what the issues are. And more recently, it's been highlighted again that PPE equipment being made in Southeast Asia has been made at the hands of people being exploited, because there's a big marketplace for people now. There's been tens and hundreds of thousands of people displaced in Southeast Asia and across Asia. These are now looking for jobs, and unscrupulous and criminal actors are looking for them and finding them positions where they know they're going to be exploited. But then we need to look wider and how the business world interacts with this. It may be a car wash in a town, in a city, a big problem certainly across Europe, manufacturing of clothes. It may be, as you mentioned, Sarah, on the bottom right-hand side there, the mining of mica or cocoa or agricultural sector. All of these have connections and supply chains. And we will often hear people say it's very difficult to check these supply chains. Yet we can fly from one end of the world to the other non-stop. We have the technology to do that. We can do it without even having somebody controlling the aircraft. But we can't check a supply chain. We can dig hundreds of feet below the ground to find these minerals, but we can't make sure who the children are in those supply chains, who's working down there, the children that are dying. The ILO estimates 22,000 children die each year in exploitative conditions in work. Well, when 2 planes crashed last year, quite rightly, the fleet was grounded at the cost of 340 lives. That cost Boeing billions. It cost the airline industry billions. There were sanctions coming out of it and a criminal investigation. 22,000 children die, and we don't know how many adults die. Nothing happens. If we look at British Airways, only last week were fined 20 million for data protection offences or breaches, 20 million pounds. But you have trafficking in your supply chain, nothing. If we look at the emissions and the Volkswagen scandal, in the US alone, the penalty was $2.8 billion for fiddling your emissions. So we don't have enough clout and sanctions and reasons why companies check their supply chains. It's too, at the moment, I would say, much of a nice to do as opposed to a must do. So, and also we've got displaced people around the world who are adding to that marketplace, who are there, who criminals are looking at, and nobody's getting pursued or prosecuted. But when I look at this, we need a wider body of people involved in this. We need the justice system ramped up. We need labour inspectors and unions. We need the health sector, local authorities, including education, transport, business and trade, and civil society. This is nothing new because this is all what's included in the Council of Europe Convention and parts of the Palermo Protocol. But the Palermo Protocol is now 20 years old. We need to start doing what these frameworks suggest and tell us and recommend. But if we look at what is the driver of this, what is the driver of the hatred that does this? What is underpinning it all? And it's money. It's money. 150 billion US dollars a year is the estimate. And that is trading off of 40.3 million people in exploitation. So what is done to reduce that money? What is done around profit if you profit from this crime? Well, for example, there are things like recruitment fees. People are paying extensive recruitment fees, sometimes taking 2 years to pay off. On average, at least 6 months to pay off. Many countries say this isn't right, but nothing is done to stop it in reality. There are some companies that will pay back when it's highlighted, but it's not enough to prevent it. Sometimes it's worth taking the risk, and if you're caught, you pay back. And there's no sanction. You don't lose business, you don't lose trade. We need these to be things that are actually mandated. And then we look at remittances. And remittances are something that some countries rely on enormously. And yet, those who are migrant workers, those who are the lowest paid workers, have to pay 12% to transfer remittances. And we also know there are criminal networks that steal some of the remittances or take it for debt bondage. So we need to have governance around this. We need to have access to bank accounts and to good measures of pay electronically for migrant workers to eliminate this. And business and others will say it's very difficult. I heard one business that's a multi-billion pound business, globally operating, who had to pay 1 million back in pay that hadn't been paid. And they said, well, it's going to take us at least 12 months to 2 years to actually, work that sum out. Yet their advertising will be in the tens of millions. So we need to look at these things and start calling it out as it is. If we look here, Verite, just in Southeast Asia, estimate that 1.4 billion can be attributed to illegal recruitment fees to workers. That's how serious this is. Criminals are earning 1.4 billion with impunity in the workplace. And the big businesses keep saying it's too difficult, it's too difficult. Well, it's too difficult if they don't have to do it. Obviously, Sarah mentioned the SDGs, and of course, SDG 8.7 gives us a mandate of what we should be doing. Ending child soldiers and child labour by 2025, probably a bit ambitious now, but we have got a decade left to break this cycle of human trafficking and modern slavery, at least to break the cycle, the model, to make sure that businesses don't see this as business as usual. We may have another decade in order to properly eradicate it, but we can break the model by 2030. And that will take a lot of work. But to do that, I have 6 points that I think we should look at. Government procurement and business culture should end using modern slavery. We do not allow our governments to use our taxpayers' money and give it to people who are exploiting at the end of a supply chain. We should call on them to do the right thing. 1 in every $5 around the world is spent by a government. And they should then mandate that businesses, if they're going to get government procurement, they need to produce evidence that they're not allowing that to happen in their supply chain and they've got effective models. We need to create this idea, number 2, of tainted money, to start to look at the profit that comes from modern slavery and human trafficking. And that can operate at high levels and low levels. At premises where people are exploited, even a small factory, even for sexual exploitation, who is earning the profit? Well, it might be the landlord, it might be the taxis, it may be somebody who's providing services. We don't need to take away capital, but we need to start saying no one can profit from this crime. And if you haven't done due diligence, you're going to lose that profit. We do it for other things, so why not for this? We should make the internet subject of legal compliance. Particularly during COVID, the internet has been exploded with the exploitation. There is more exploitation online now than ever. Children being lured into sex acts online, people being recruited and exploited. We need that to be stopped. And we need the businesses who run these platforms to be held accountable, just like we would have in our real highways, where there would be governance and rules, local authority accountability, business accountability about the time you open, the time you close, your services you provide. Well, let's make that the laws of the internet. Why has it got some special position? Why does it keep saying the freedom of speech? Child abuse should not be protected by the freedom of speech. Of course, the freedom of speech is important, but the two are not connected. International instruments. We need to look at international instruments. The Slavery Convention of 1936 didn't imagine there being an internet or flying around the world as we can now, or could until March. We need to look at those and update them. We don't need new ones, but we need to modernize what they say and translate them into the modern language, the modern world. Multilateral agencies, we need to look at more multilateral agencies who can play a role. The World Bank, the World Health Organization, the International Criminal Courts. I know in the US, maybe that may be challenged, but they are used extensively, particularly in Europe and in Africa and other places. Let's use them for the power they can give. And let's look at sanctions that can be used more effectively. The US does use its Tariff Act quite well. Well, let's see things like that become the norm. But we need to reset the moral compass. We need to reset the moral compass of business leaders, making sure that they understand human rights, which was part of the SDGs, is part of their business as usual, just as much as procurement, HR, insurance policies, trade, profit. The moral compass should be facing one way. And I think over the last 20 years, the moral compass has been lost. And that's why human rights, I think, are lost in a system somewhere and not properly understood. Well, that's going to take a lot of work, but it's got to be something that civil society and people have got to start pushing. So that's my presentation, really covering the general side of this. There is a lot to do. I think the instruments and the tools are there, but I think it needs people, particularly those with legal training and legal backgrounds and those in human rights, to actually make sure that this is delivered. I've met a number of those 40 million people, young girls who have been trafficked and exploited, who have been raped, who've been traded, young boys who've been lured on the promise of football, being football professionals, and then ended up being sexually exploited or beaten. By working this out properly, it's those people that we can protect. But we need to understand the rules, we need to engage those rules, and we need to create the responsibilities and the accountabilities for those who are allowing or permitting these crimes to be committed. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kevin. That really does a lot to help us understand just what's happening. John, could I ask you to give a perspective on the risks that vulnerable workers are facing in the United States these days?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be on the panel with you, Kevin and Sarah. And I'm always happy to come back to CUA Law to give a presentation about what I do. So I think my practical experience in so first of all, I'm a union lawyer. I represent workers working in grocery stores, meat packing plants, food processing plants, hospitals, nursing homes, and public sector employees. So those are the kind of sectors I work in. But I think my practical experience in the meat packing and food processing industries is probably my best entry point into this discussion right now in these COVID times, especially. So some of the most vulnerable workers in our country work in packing plants and food processing industries. They are very difficult jobs. They are dirty, they are dangerous, and people that are lowest on the societal rungs often take those jobs. They are set up usually in rural, poor areas, and they're often the only job in town. It's largely a minority and immigrant workforce in those industries. We know that the pandemic has fallen hardest on exactly those demographics lately. But I think to take a step back for a second and just talk about what work in like a packing plant looks like, they're cold. And there's been some research now and some science that suggests that even just the cold air is exacerbating the spread of the disease in the plants. It's not settled, but there is some evidence. Workers often have to work because of what they are doing as their job very close to each other. So it's a perfect setup for the spread of disease. Remembering that a lot of these plants are slaughtering big animals, hogs, cattle. And so they have to it takes more than one person to tear those animals apart when they're on the line. We also know that the people working in these plants they're already facing hardships that are brought by deregulation. For example, after the 2016 election, the federal government allowed employers in these plants to increase line speeds, which means that they have to process more animals per hour. Or it allows employers to force them to slaughter more animals per hour as they come down the line. All of that is to say that they have been deregulated coming into this pandemic. And also there's other issues there. There's undocumented folks working in the workforce. We know that undocumented folks have fewer basic protections than documented folks. We know that because, first of all, there's fear amongst undocumented folks and even documented folks sometimes to report violations in their workplaces, fear of retaliation. But if you're undocumented, the US Supreme Court says that there's less recourse for you to get things like back pay if you are retaliated against and fired for reporting an occupational safety and health complaint. We suspect that the same would be true. I'm sorry, that was you have retaliation. If you're undocumented and you're retaliated against for speaking out about working conditions, you are unable to be awarded by the courts back pay for even if it's proven that you were discriminated against and retaliated against. We suspect that the same is true of occupational safety and health retaliation because the law is written so similarly to the National Labor Relations Act law. The meatpacking industry alone has accounted for some of the larger super spreader events for COVID in the United States. It's over 40,000 packing workers have been afflicted by COVID-19 that we know of. More than 200 of those workers have died. They work in very rural areas. Their towns are pretty tight-knit communities. They often either get it in the town and bring it to the plant or bring it from the plant back into the town. They give it to, it's not just the workers that are being affected for those 40,000 workers. Even if the rate of transmission is one more person, right? You have another 40,000 people that the disease is spreading to. So the CDC has recognized this. This is not controversial. They've got a whole website to the problems facing workers in food processing and meat processing plants. The federal government has actually ordered these plants to remain open for the duration of the national emergency related to COVID. The problem with that is that and I'll get into this as we kind of go through the questions, but the problem with that is, as we've seen now, and it's been demonstrated, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration, has not applied the kind of scrutiny that would be required of these plants to ensure better worker safety. So workers are forced to go to work. Occupational safety and health standards are just abysmally low on the federal level. So we have a scattershot approach where if you are in a state with a robust occupational safety and health regime, like California, for example, you are far more protected than if you are in a state like the Dakotas or one of the Dakotas, or where we've seen even North Carolina, where I do some work with workers. So it's a scattershot approach, and it really affects accountability for these employers. They have the unfettered right to remain open. In fact, they've been ordered by the federal government to remain open, but there's not much supervision of that reopening, and there's not much regulation of it. So I think with that, I've got some specific examples I think I'd like to go into as we kind of go through the question and answers.
Great, thank you so much, John. So as you both alluded to, there's a problem with the moral compass, whether it's in the United States and how people are treated in meat processing plants, or in what businesses are willing to accept in their supply chains, or maybe I should say just don't know or don't take the effort to look. But everybody from governments to the United Nations, NGOs, faith groups, business people themselves have called again and again for the end to modern day slavery, for human rights abuses, for extreme forms of labor exploitation. But these problems seem to continue, and they're pervasive and persistent, as I think Kevin pointed out, and you gave us some reasons, John, in the US. The United Nations Human Rights Council, the ILO, and other organizations have engaged in major efforts to attempt to eradicate human rights. But are non-binding standards such as the Sustainable Development Goals and the guiding principles on business and human rights making a difference? And if not, or even if not enough is kind of obviously true, what are the obstacles to transnational regulation and transnational standards?
So just to comment as well on John's presentation,
Sure.
A number of the issues that he raised there from COVID are exactly what we'd see in Ireland and in across Europe, with particularly meat plants and agriculture, exactly as John is saying in the US. So, that just shows that this doesn't have a border. But I think the point you raised, Sarah, is that, we have got the non-binding Sustainable Development Goals. And when they were launched, it was kind of a wonderful moment and everybody thought that was going to be a big game changer. And then, we've had commitment, we celebrate all the time for perhaps, kind of the Palermo Protocol. But, we have to be realistic about this. We have to be realistic and also understand that, when a board of a big company is making a decision, when they've come to COVID, there's certain factors they're having to think about. There's things that they have to do. Well, one of them isn't about supply chains or people along the line. And so at a time when what they do is more critical than ever, not just to, the performance of the company, but to the lives of these people, whether they live or die in some ways, doesn't become part of the, considerations. It didn't before, and it doesn't now. Now, the OSCE has come up with a guidance, which I would recommend everybody to look at, around what responses are needed for COVID, which include, a number of things really, saying do what you should have been doing already. But I believe that We have some very strong laws, but we're having to fight this case by case. And it's because we got people like John on this that we do win those cases. But we need to create this as business as usual. When I travel around the world and I was in Thailand at the beginning of this year, and I was in a hotel and it had the same signs for a fire exit and governance for that as would be in a building in New York or Washington or London. You know, it's all governed by rules and regulations. We have rules and regulations that we can work around the world for sport. If you play soccer, you know, at the World Cup, the rules are the same whatever country you come from, and the way you manage it and the way you win and the scores and the goals and the points is the same. But when it comes to business and business accountability, we've kind of fudged it, and it's voluntary. Yet the consequences and the outcomes are so major, and then everything is fought case by case. We don't have that with the air industry. We don't have that with food standards in most parts of the world. But with people, we've forgotten them. And until that is mandated, in the UK, if you have illegal immigrants working in your company, you will get a mandatory fine of £10,000 per person, because you haven't done the due diligence properly. Even if they produce forged documents, you still get that fine. But if you have people who are in modern slavery, and you are not the person responsible for it because you come out and say, well, somebody else brought them in and so forth, which we've seen a number of times, you get away scot-free. So we need to flip it. We need to make sure that there is a duty on people. And just on the business side of it, if you take the history of William Wilberforce, obviously the British politician who brought the end of the transatlantic slave trade from the UK side, he was up against it when he was demanding that in Parliament. He was told he was going to bring down the British Empire. In fact, it was Lord Horatio Nelson who wrote a scathing letter about him, saying that he was a lunatic and everything he was going to do was going to affect the economy of the UK. When the UK did actually, you know, end slavery and stop doing it with the transatlantic slave trade, the actual economy of the UK went up and up and up. So we need to look at, you know, we're relying on cheap labor, cheap workers, exploitation to sustain a business model that is flawed. And I think that when we understand it like that and we bring in the legislation and the laws that prevent that, then we will see some real change.
Thank you.
Yeah.
John, you want to?
Yeah, Kevin is obviously far more qualified to speak about the international regimes than I am. But I think from my point of view, I would point out that the places, these packing plants, they're international concerns. They're transnational companies. The plant that I represent 5,500 workers at in Tar Heel, North Carolina, they ship a lot of the pork that they process from that Smithfield plant to Asia, for example. And so I think that's again an entry point to talk about, well, if they exist transnationally, why aren't they regulated transnationally? I will tell you, just from my practice, you know, occasionally we will go and appeal to places like the International Labor Organization, stuff like that. But we know when we're appealing to them that it's either a last-ditch effort or an effort that is unlikely to give us much more than a public relations victory. And the companies know that as well. And so I think we need, as Kevin is saying, we need concerted regulation. That's not, as I said, in the United States on our national level, we don't have that, but we lack that entirely on an international level as well. It's something I think we need, as Kevin has said, to reset our moral compass on, and to start centering the people that are so exploited by these processes.
Great, thank you both. I just want to focus on you both referred to some of the laws that do exist. We've got the OSHA laws, the occupational health and safety laws at federal and state or provincial levels in most countries. We've also got some newer statutes like the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act, the Tariff Act, and the Dodd-Frank Conflict Minerals provision in the US. And then we've got the UK's Modern Slavery Act and new laws in Australia. Are these laws making a difference? And can you just comment on whether they're helping and how?
Well, they're helping in some ways because they're raising the issue. You know, the UK Modern Slavery Act was very similar to the California legislation, where your statement could actually be, we're doing nothing, you know, and it could be written in 5 minutes. and many were, and cut and paste of another, and then that had to be published on your website.
That's
but
because
it
it's
was
just
really,
about publishing information about what you're doing as opposed to
yeah,
taking any real
yeah,
action.
that exactly. And so there was no, and actually, even though companies weren't completing the law, which said over a 36 million pound trading, you had to do a statement. There was, I identified 40 of the top 100 companies dealing with the UK government hadn't done statements. So you could still get government procurement even if you hadn't fulfilled the requirement of the British law. Now that is changing, that is changing, but there's no real teeth to any of this legislation. I'd say the only one that does really have it is your Tariff Act, because hey, when you can't trade with the US, it becomes an important thing because you're going to lose massive business. And also there's the French due diligence law, which is still being tested. So they're the two pieces of legislation that do make a difference. But I think the Australian legislation has gone one step further than the UK legislation. But I think it goes back to, I've done a number of articles, and I'm no way anti-business. I think business is a bringer of opportunity, but I do think there is a need, and some countries have the legislation, including the UK, that has got the potential to be used in this way. But if a company is full of this crime, and that's what we need to talk about, it's a crime, it's a human rights violation, importantly. But human trafficking and modern slavery are serious crimes that in the UK, for example, and Ireland, hold life imprisonment. We need to make sure that the investigations are done right. In the Irish law, there is a corporate possibility of prosecution. And we need to start saying, who is the CEO who needs to stand in the dock? What CEO needs to be actually there facing a potential lengthy sentence in prison? Because once that happens, you will see a change. And, we've seen it in other things. We've seen it in emissions, cars being fiddled, that there are criminal investigations. We've seen it in the food horse meat scandal you may have heard of in Europe, which was actually a criminal enterprise who were, getting horses and selling it as top quality beef. Well, that was a big investigation across Europe. And so because the food standards were breached and it was us eating the food, there was a big reaction. But because it's this third class person who is somewhere that we don't see, and it's not going to affect us because we're not going to be eating that, if it was a food violation or something, you think about if there was an outbreak of something in the US in a city or a town and lots of people got poisoned, the litigation would roll on and roll on and roll on, and it would catch every layer. They would find out who held the responsibility, even if it was going to Southeast Asia and finding it was a company packing the stuff out there. Even if it went through 5 or 6 other distributors afterwards, they would find out where it came from for litigation purposes. But when it comes to humans who aren't us, there's a kind of a different attitude.
Thank you. John, did you want to comment on that? Or?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think in the United States, for example, the way I would put it is consequences matter. And a recent example, in fact, it came today. The New York Times published an article about the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration's response to documented and proven safety violations related to COVID in several different packing plants. The one it focused on initially was in Colorado. And the federal OSHA fined, after a months-long investigation, they fined this packing plant $15,500 for the violation they found. And that's, the packing plant was run by JBS, which is a mega corporation. That's nothing. That's pocket change for us. It's a cup of coffee. Shortly after they received that fine, the company announced that it was unilaterally revoking its program that granted paid leave to workers that were in high-risk health categories. The company swears up and down that this was not a response to the fact that it didn't face any consequences for its previous violations. As a lawyer, I would say that the timing is suspicious. We always look for proximity and timing when we're trying to prove cases. In this case, it was pretty proximate. It was days. the worker representative at the plant commented that now the company knows where the ceiling is. If other workers die, it's not going to cost them that much. There was a super spreader event at this plant. And so, like I said, the approach in the United States is scattershot. That was a plant in Colorado. They filed a federal OSHA complaint. A similar violations at a plant in California, on the other hand, the plant was fined over $220,000 for these violations. Again, that ups the cost of doing business for the plant. I think it should be more, frankly. Like Kevin said previously, this is a life and death matter. These people are going into work and they are facing literal threats to their lives. And so again, consequences matter. And if we don't have consequences on these things, companies will take advantage of that. That's kind of the nature of the game. So that, I think that's the kind of example I wanted to give for how these consequences matter.
Great, thank you very much, both of you. I wanted to go and talk a little bit about what global companies and business groups say they are doing, the kinds of steps they say they're taking, whether they're actually doing it. And that fits very well with one of the questions we have from the chat. You've opened our eyes about many failures of business on this issue. Can you give us any examples of companies who are doing a good job and offer models of what other businesses or all businesses should do? So if you could address a little bit about what's going on out there, what are businesses saying they're doing? Are they really doing it? And are they making a difference?
Yes, and I think there is some good news out there. The work I do with the Institute of Human Rights and Business has 13 of the world's biggest companies are members of it, and there's different levels, but one of the main objectives is to eradicate recruitment fees and to make labor standards better. But there are companies, so for example IKEA, a very big furniture company based in Europe, they have gone all the way to actually they want certification all the way down of where their goods come from. Now, they've done that for years around sustainable products and, obviously forestry and that, but they've now incorporated that into their human commodities that are in their supply chains. And they will sit at meetings and say this is a priority for them and something that they really must do. And so because the board is saying that, it happens. And they would be quite happy, and a number of the companies would be quite happy, and some call for more legislation around this to create the the level playing field. And we do see actually countries, for example, Qatar has now outlawed the idea of the tied visa, where somebody who goes to Qatar can only work for that employer. This year that was made illegal there, which is a big step forward, but that came out of a lot of attention because the World Cup being there in 2022 and the political interest and obviously the public interest and the media reporting about workers actually being severely abused, particularly coming from Indonesia for labor, and then not being able to get away from their employer.
Just to explain for a minute, the tied visa, as I understand it, means that if you come in with a visa to work for a particular employer and you leave that employer, you're essentially deported. And so that tied visa in some ways there are a lot of similar things in other countries, even some aspects of the J1 visa here in the US. So please go ahead. I just wanted to.
Yeah, and the tied visa can really make you vulnerable because the employer can actually say to you, if you don't do what I say, and if you say anything bad about me, I'm going to withdraw your work anyway, and you're gone. So, you're in a catch-22. And even if you do come out of it and complain, your status in the country's gone anyway. So, that's been something that's been campaigned for. And we have seen that in Qatar. And we do see more countries talking about, removing that. So there is some good examples there of companies who are pushing the limits and looking for solutions. There was, exposés about the prawn fishing in Thailand, and it wasn't actually the prawns where the exploitation, it was the feed for the prawns. And then there was a policy brought in there about, making sure that it was locally employed people and local contracts. New Zealand, for example, looked at the fishing industry in New Zealand, and anybody who fishes in their waters now has to fly a New Zealand flag. So they have to go and register to be in their waters. And if they're not registered in New Zealand, you're not fishing there, or you're going to be, hauled in. So that meant there was some governance and regulation around the fishing industry, which we know is a very highly exploitative form of employment. So there's lots of examples where there has been progress, but it's one or two companies. And what has happened, some work and I was looking at, one of the big construction companies said, we mandated that when we were doing contracts in the Middle East, that we would have contracts and we would have sets of minimum wages and all the rest of it. And we would make sure that recruitment was done in a certain way. But they said then, other companies that maybe even working on the same site weren't doing the same governance. And it became really difficult. And, they said, unless there's something across the board that governs everybody in the same way. And it wasn't really about being less or more competitive, because they said the price doesn't change because someone's being paid less, because everybody charges the same, give or take a small amount. It was more about, once you get them on site, who was the greedy employer, or who were the greedy contractors, who were the greedy agents, and all of the rest of it, and who were the criminals involved, and a lack of governance from the overall contractor that really contributed to, where you've got one lot doing a good job and just down the road another lot doing a really poor job. So companies felt that even though they were making better efforts, it didn't give them any competitive edge, it didn't give them any extra points, and whilst they had to put more effort in, they created more accountability for themselves, that if it didn't operate next door, nothing changed. So that was something that really spoke to me, that there needs to be more that's regulated and mandated as opposed to a voluntary change.
Thank you. Just, John, I'm going to ask you to respond to that too, but just because we have a question here about, someone says, I've read about awful, often fatal slavery in the fishing industry in a book called The Outlaw Ocean. That's a great book. Are there different challenges addressing this problem in international waters? And since you mentioned the fishing industry, I thought we'd ask you to talk about that, and then John, I'll come back to you.
Yes, sorry, the fishing industry, and it's a particular problem I've seen around the world. And there has been projects, there's Project ISARA done in Southeast Asia, which created a hotline and, was very successful for people to call in. But it's not just over there in Southeast Asia. It's an issue, in the North Atlantic. It's an issue where there are, these visas that people can get to travel to a country just to board a vessel, but then they can no longer step on land in that country. So they're tied to a ship or tied to a vessel. And of course, there's been serious allegations in some places where, people have been seriously hurt or actually, have been thrown overboard because they're objecting. And the other thing is, because it's very much a migrant workforce, and because there are recruitment fees, because they come on these irregular visas, particularly when you see it in the European perspective, because they're not used to fishing in the weather that you will get in the North Atlantic compared to where they come from in Africa. And then because the workers then, are tied, in Ireland, for example, there is still a tied visa, believe it or not, for the fishing industry. They call it the atypical scheme. And, when you look at all of these things coming together, and then no access to healthcare, not allowed to step on land, you are creating a perfect scenario for exploitation to happen. And there is very little that really wants that to push away. And particularly in the EU perspective at the moment, with the Brexit negotiations that are going on, one of the biggest arguments is around the fishing industry, because it is a very lucrative business. But nobody in those conversations are talking about working standards. It's all about quotas. And, there were some people who worked for Customs and Excise who were telling me that they board vessels regularly to check the fish and the quantities being caught and the quality and so on and so forth. And vessels actually get boarded as well by inspectorates to check the quality of the vessel. But nobody at all was looking at the people who were on deck or down the bottom, which shows how low down the workforce is considered versus the quality of the vessel or the catch.
Thank you. John, how about from your perspective in the US, are you seeing from companies trying trying to or saying they're addressing human rights abuses? And are there any good models that you could cite to us?
Sure. I was thinking about this question more in terms of companies' responses to COVID, especially. But
address that.
The one example from my personal experience that I've worked on, and I reserve the right to revoke my praise of this example, but and part of the reason for that is because it's very voluntary. You know, they could change their mind tomorrow. There's a major deli meat processing plant in Virginia that I represent the workers at. And they have done a pretty good job. And part of this proves the point that they can do this and remain profitable and all of those things. They've done a pretty good job they've had a couple of cases. They had a couple of cases early on. As soon as they had a couple of cases, they shut the plant down for several days. They cleared everybody out. They told them to go home. They paid them. And then they after several days they sanitized the plant. They brought them back. And that cut down tremendously in our and this was just the experience. It cut down tremendously on the virus spreading within the plant. Now it probably still spread a little bit in the community, but not having everybody packed together in the same rooms was a tremendous help in that circumstance. And then we've seen, like in the grocery industry, we have seen some of our employers at least initially giving hazard pay to people who are coming into work. But like I said, it's all pretty unilateral. It's not regulated, and so we're relying on the goodwill of these companies, and that's a big problem. Even in a unionized setting where we do have some ability to bargain over these things, it's such a fast moving thing that without that regulatory framework, you can't bargain quickly enough to get your hands around what's going on in these plants. And so I think there have been some examples at least of respecting workers' rights around COVID. But like I said, they're tenuous.
Thank you. There is a question in the Q&A that I did want to just add, since you referred to the role of unions. One of our viewers is asking, can you tell us more about the role of unions in solving human rights problems?
Sure. So here's the thing, sometimes it's used to slam unions, right? Is that unions have, for example, they'll say unionized workplaces have more occupational safety and health complaints brought against them. There's a good reason for that. And that's because workers are protected when they're protected under union contracts, when they have a union to get their back, they feel more empowered to stand up and say something is wrong in this workplace. The line speeds too fast. The boss is making me do a dangerous task without the proper safety equipment. And so I think unions have a major role just on that level. But of course, unions also advocate in legislatures, in world bodies even, for protections for workers. And so they can act as an interest group on behalf of all workers. So I think both, and on both those fronts, they're very helpful. Also, just our union contracts, the collective bargaining agreements that cover these workers, typically have safety and health language. And so they even more specifically than OSHA or a federal regulator, regulate the specific workplace within which workers work. And then they also have things like joint labor management committees where both representatives of management, representatives of labor, unions get together, and they, on a regular basis, they discuss issues of, for example, safety. There's joint labor management committees about safety where they discuss those things, they raise them. And even just that, I think, is quite helpful to eliminating certain safety risks. They don't always agree, but sometimes they do. When you're forced to get together at that level, it gives at least some mechanism for sorting out these sorts of concerns and these sorts of and ratting out these sorts of abuses in the workplace. So
great, thank you. I see another question in the chat that asks about journalists, And one of the questions, this question says, my training is in journalists, so I'd like to know, are journalists in the US and in the world doing enough to cover stories of human trafficking and inhumane working conditions? In other words, to expose human rights abuses in supply chains. We've seen many stories, but is it enough? Can more be done?
Yeah, so it's a very important point, and they've been responsible for exposing so much. Journalists and investigative journalists of, really some of the biggest cases, like the exploitation in Thailand in the fishing industry was exposed by The Guardian. The fishing industry in Europe was again by The Guardian. And Thomson Reuters Foundation have one of their focuses is training journalists around the world in how to report on this, and they've got people employed who do that role and who report, and so they've done a lot over the years, but there is not sufficient, I don't think, that actually brings it back to what's happening in countries that we forget that this happens in the United States, in Ireland, in the United Kingdom. From my perspective, I'll talk about the United Kingdom and Ireland. Yes, there is, particularly in the UK, there is a lot of exposés about individual cases and issues that are going on, but they don't go down in depth enough to show that link between the top level of a company and where the responsibility should lie. The only one that I've seen that really has been impactful was in Leicester, as I mentioned, it was in the fashion industry. And it was undercover journalists who started looking at the COVID issue. That's what brought them into it, because they heard of people working in breach of COVID rules and regulations. And what they exposed was this wholesale violation of human rights, people not being paid, people being held against their will, people being exploited. But it was the COVID that exposed it, because that's what they went to look at. So I think there needs to be a lot more done by journalists, really understanding the issue in a deeper way, trying to connect it to decisions and policies and the breaches or the ignorance of current policies that allow all of these kind of things just to happen on a daily basis and 40 million times. And many of those will be in the US. And just also, if you looked at, say, the US State Department's own report this year from the Trafficking in Persons Office, it's actually that where we think that we assume the progress will be in, the Americas, in Europe, they're all the areas that are going down in their response to this. And we're seeing increases in the response in Africa and Southeast Asia, where you're seeing more prosecutions and more victim identification, whereas in our own backyard, there's actually less. I think there was 850 convictions in the whole of I think it's 27 countries, isn't it, from Argentina up to Canada in the whole year, which, when you think of it on the scale of other serious crime, is a drop in the ocean. And the same kind of figures, a bit more, but across Europe, but nothing to write home about. And I think journalists need to look at those figures and look at the lack of response and start to identify who has responsibility and where should the accountability lie.
Thank you.
Yeah.
John, did you want to add?
Yeah, I don't think you can't really speak about labor history in the United States without speaking about journalists. I'm thinking of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, right? I think that journalists have had a really incredible role in exposing labor rights violations in the United States, and they continue to. I referenced that New York Times article that came out today, but like all of the major newspapers have been following the COVID outbreak, especially in the United States, as a labor issue, in addition to being a public health issue. I think, frankly, that's because it's been so horrific. I mean, it kind of goes back to if it bleeds, it leads. So there's some funding for that. I will say the problem in the United States, from my point of view, is that when I started doing this, when I started practicing labor law, most of the major newspapers still had labor reporters, but as the industry has faced its own financial troubles, labor reporters were some of the first to go, and so there's fewer resources within news sources now dedicated to that kind of reporting, and so it's again, it's like it's one of those, going back to Kevin's moral compass. we made a choice. At some point, people made a choice to kind of take funding from that and put it towards something else. And that's it's a problem. And yeah, I'd like to see more labor journalists, frankly, in the U.S.
Great, thank you. You've already both talked a bit about the impact of the pandemic, but I want to ask you about something very specific. UN Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur Tumaya Obokata and others have said that the COVID-19 crisis has greatly exacerbated the potential for human rights abuses in global supply chains. And I think you both alluded to some things. There's been a rollback in some ways of labor protections in order to allow, for example, to require meat processing plants to stay open in the United States. Some countries apparently are making conditions easier, perhaps with the idea that we want to facilitate the ability of people to keep working through all of this. And I wonder if just in general, you have any comments about, I know we talked about COVID-19 as a lens, but what about the overall impact of the pandemic on the most vulnerable people in these supply chains?
Well, I think there's, so much evidence out there that the most vulnerable are suffering more. And if we look at, what's happening in India, hundreds of thousands of people are losing their jobs, being laid off. And these were some of the most vulnerable anyway, on the lowest pay, living day by day. And there's already evidence that, in places like Myanmar, people are looking for these people, identifying them and starting to offer them to come to places where there's already lots of unemployment, in perhaps Thailand, and looking for those routes. And, on the sexual exploitation, particularly of girls in Myanmar, who are being sold into China for marriages, that's not just a business supply chain, but it's another form of supply chain. But if we look, in my side of the world, there was, they realized there was a shortage of agricultural workers. And, when you think, and this was at the height of the first lockdown, when there was all these rules about travel, about flying, about masks, about, distancing, they were bringing in lots of people from Eastern Europe, chartering planes, bringing them in. They'd arrive, at an airport. There would be no measures for them. There would be no help. They'd just be told, yeah, there's a job for you there. They'd go and live in multiple occupancy, unfit. And this is in this side of the world. And that was in breach, really, of many of the regulations that were applying to residents or people who were already there. But they were so worried about these industries being affected. Now, of course, bring in migrant workers, a great idea, give people an opportunity, but have protection for them when they arrive, have policies, have processes that go out and physically check where they're going to live, have a contract, make sure they're getting the minimum wage or the living wage. These are all very simple things to do when you decide you're going to bring in 500 or 1,000 people to work in a particular industry. But none of that was included in a policy decision. And they're the things that actually have exacerbated this issue, because then they catch COVID, because they're living so close together. Then they give it to the community. The community then turns about against them because they're migrant workers. The company then has to close down for a period of work, so prices go up. And this is all coming because of bad governance, bad management, and bad policy decision. Sometimes and often because the government isn't making it part of their decision making. We see all of these policies about COVID. We're in a second lockdown here in Ireland. I can't read anything that talks about migrant workers and those at risk. They've had to do something about where they place people who are looking for asylum, and many of those will be in those conditions and those circumstances. But that was because there was public outcry and political outcry before COVID. But there is nothing specific for these most vulnerable workers that you can pick up a policy and say, that's what should be done, that's what needs to be done. And you've got to ask yourself, why not? Why is that not happening? And that's in developed nations like the UK, Ireland, and across Europe. So you imagine what it's like when you get to areas where there was no rules and no governance and no union rights and no representation already.
Thank you.
Yeah.
John, you mentioned a few things, but can you add a little bit from your perspective?
Yeah, no, it's very much the same here. I mean, one of the interesting like examples that arose earlier on in the pandemic here was there was a lawsuit filed in Missouri against Smithfield, a Smithfield packing plant. It was non-unionized, but it was filed not just by the workers at the plant, but also community members in the community in which the plant was based. And the legal theory it was filed under was public nuisance grounds, that the plant, because it served as kind of a super spreader of the virus, had created a public nuisance in the community in that town. And you talk about vulnerable workers, again, minority and immigrant populations in these towns, in these plants. And the workers would go to work, they'd get the virus, they'd bring it back, and they'd take it to somebody somebody like their grandmother who they were living with, right? Or their mother or their father or their son or their daughter who had asthma. And so it was a novel theory. The judge, I actually thought the judge gave it more time of day than I thought he would. He's a relatively conservative judge, and it was filed in federal court. He dismissed it without prejudice because the Occupational Safety and Health Administration was also investigating the plant at the time. It's kind of cold comfort now that we know what OSHA did in the Colorado case in the Dakotas with the really meager fines, but at the time, part of the judge's theory was that again, a conservative judge that I probably wouldn't agree with on much, but part of the judge's theory was we have to wait for the federal government to create a federal response to this before I start nitpicking into this locality versus that locality. And so in theory, that's right. Unfortunately, in practice, our federal government didn't act to regulate in the way I think it should have to protect workers. But again, you talk about the most vulnerable. It's not just the workers who are vulnerable themselves, but it's their families and their parents and other people in their communities that are being affected by these decisions.
Thank you. We've been talking a little bit about different kinds of business people and journalists, and we have a couple of questions that have been raised in the Q&A about lawyers. What about in-house counsel? How can we make in-house counsel treat human rights issues as a priority? And how do we educate lawyers who are advising these big companies in particular, and some of the smaller ones too? Why don't those of us who are lawyers bear responsibility as gatekeepers in all of these human rights issues? What could we do as a profession? Why don't we take more responsibility?
Yeah. So my response to that is first probably one of a bit of skepticism. I think in-house lawyers often view themselves, and partially correctly so under our legal regime, as protectors of the company from legal exposures. And so we'll often see that as antithetical to kind of action to protect, especially in my case, workers. On the other hand, I will say this, in my practice on the union side, and on the union side bar, we all know who the management lawyers are, who the in-house lawyers are, who are reasonable, who are compassionate human beings. And so I think, I would say on the margins, it makes at least on the margins, it does make a difference that, that people think about these things and don't just think about the exposure or the bottom line or those types of things. Having a moral compass, and even on the individual level, matters. And so that's been my experience with that question, at least.
Kevin, anything? Thank you, John. Anything to add about the lawyers, or?
Yeah, no, I think just to support what John says there, but I do think the lawyers will work within a framework of what is in the interest of the company, but they need to take that step, I think, sometimes to actually start to highlight the risk. But we need to create the risk, and that's where the join up comes. The journalists can create the risk, the public can create the risk, reputation of the business. We need more of that. That's why I talk about the moral compass. And then lawyers will start to say the risk of not doing something can be greater than the risk of doing something. And we need to flip that, because that's what lawyers do. They try to mitigate risk, quite rightly. but it's that balance. Which side is the risk on? Sometimes the risk might be greater by doing something, is what they will perceive.
I hope a few of us also work because we have consciences, but I think you're right. Risk management is a big deal, especially these days. We have courses in risk management now in law school, so you're exactly right. On the same line, we've got a question about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which, as you probably are both aware, that is a huge deal in the United States, and fines that matter. It's actually when we teach courses now in internal investigations, for example, we look a lot to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We have a whole course on international crime and corruption and compliance dealing with the Corrupt Practices Act. And one of our viewers says, in the last 10 years, this has been critical for preventing international corruption. Don't you think increased fines for human trafficking at a much higher level is one of the key solutions in preventing? And I think you both mentioned some of that, but did you want to say a little bit more about the importance of increasing and really applying fines?
Yeah, I think the attitude towards bribery and corruption, where companies have to take, proactive steps to make sure they don't get involved in it, even unwittingly to a degree, is exactly what we need to have with this approach to, other human rights, and particularly in this case, modern slavery. And they will employ teams of lawyers to make sure that doesn't happen. It's a bit like, data protection. There'll be people employed, professionals, to make sure there are no data breaches because the sanctions are so great. But actually, to have human trafficking, there's no sanction. So, there are no fines unless you maybe get caught up in the US Tariff Act, where your fine will be that you can't trade and your stuff might be put into storage and you have to pay that, and all your goods are held, somewhere where you can't trade or you can't do business in the US. And that can really hurt you. But I think this idea of creating sanctions around a fine, for even unwittingly straying into that area, particularly if you haven't done the due diligence, because some are currently doing no due diligence whatsoever. I think that's where we will get the change, by following examples like we've done with corruption. And that has changed attitudes even down to, if I think of areas that I, did have some exposure to over my time from family members, is like in real estate. Once upon a time, the way that real estate was dealt with, and the way that one estate agent would deal with another, and they try and come up with some deal, and they might do or way local authorities might grease the palm of a local, a contractor and get their palm greased, and some sort of backhander. Even at the coalface level now, people don't do that. They can't go out and have a meal, or they have to declare. They can't be seen associating, right down to grassroots levels. And that's what's been the big success. It's not just about the corporate level right at the top. It actually feeds down into behavior of people, throughout an industry or business, or, in government or wherever.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of our time. I'm going to try to do a combined question here, and you both, if you would feel free to answer any part of it you'd like. We still have outstanding questions about whether there's been a difference between the Trump and Obama administration in policy, kind of impacts on how is online trafficking, what are some of the means, what's Apple saying and doing in this area, and then finally local law enforcement. So that's a whole kind of bag of questions, but I'd just like to ask both of you, would you pick some aspect of those and just respond to it? And then maybe John, do you want to start any of those questions?
Sure. I guess I can talk to local law enforcement, I suppose. We have had some success working with, again, I think we need this is a real collective action problem, especially on COVID, but just on labor rights in general. And a lot of the field on labor rights in the US is preempted by federal law as far as regulation on labor issues. But we definitely have had success working with local bodies and local regulators in enforcing local labor laws. Things like minimum wage laws, things like now we have paid sick leave laws, And then in COVID, we've had success working with local public health officials who have teeth and authority to go in and fine a business or maybe even shut them down if they are not following protocols to keep workers safe. So I think that's definitely an option and like a tool in our toolkit to go to the local level. But again, that creates a sort of scattershot approach that needs to be more uniform if we're really going to get serious about protecting labor rights and human rights in the workplace.
Okay, and thank you. And I guess the last question just here is, could there be a certification program to help consumers choose products? And maybe I'll ask Kevin, and could you just address that quickly, and then we'll be out of time.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to reiterate what John said about law enforcement, and being from a law enforcement background myself, they play a crucial role, but it will be very often a case-by-case business approach. We need a much wider range of, criminal justice or law enforcement action, around labor inspectorates, but also on the policy side and the kind of intervention that a government can give around sanctions or, stopping trade or these kind of other ways of fining. But the law enforcement is crucial, that we do see the actual traffickers and exploiters in the dock and, facing long terms of imprisonment. Just one other thing, it was mentioned about Apple. Apple has been have done some big changes in their supply chains in the DRC, for example, and certifying what they do and don't bring into their supplies. But it's a little bit short at the moment, and but I do think that we do need some more sanctions. We do need opportunities where we can place more out there, that where people face some sort of culpability. With consumers, I think the idea is a great idea, to be able to say this does and this does, but I would like it to be the reverse. I would like a product that's on a shelf to say this isn't certified, and then anything that doesn't have that on it, you can assume is certified. I think we need to get to that point, and placing this on the consumer. So if we say, and we hear it said a lot that, if a shirt is $5, $10 or whatever, how can it not have come from exploitation? But that's not always the test, because there are some companies, and I know some very big companies, that buy so much, have long contracts, say of a year, out in Southeast Asia. So people get a job for a year. They don't change their patterns, they don't change their designs, because they're such big bulk buyers and producers, and they can guarantee someone is paid properly for a year. You get high-end stuff that's made, and it can actually be where the exploitation is because the markup is so great and the product is so small. And if you think about the Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, where 1,000 lives were lost when the building collapsed, there were top brands and bucket shop brands as well. So it's not really always a test. So, and also, why should we put the decision making on this? These companies are making tens, hundreds of millions a year in profit. And what we're saying is that the parent who's got 4 kids, sending them out to school, who's buying the shirts and buying the uniforms or buying the boots or buying whatever, the decision lies with them. When there's someone else making billions and billions. And that example I gave you in Leicester, where there was all that expose, one of the people at the top of the company was getting a £50 million bonus. To pay everybody properly for the whole year would have cost less than 5 million. So would a 45 million bonus not have done? So, we have to be sure of what we're asking for. But I do think we should get to a position where consumers should be able to say and look at something, and if it isn't certified, it should say on it, this has not been certified as being free from exploitation. And then you see the change, because nobody will buy that. Nobody will pick that up. They'll all go for something different. If it says, yes, we've done all we can, we put it on tins about tuna, we put it on tins about other things, that this is sustainably supplied. But do people actually go and pick it up? Some do, and I would do when I'm looking for certain brands and all the rest of it. But I think on the whole, we need to start making it that we make it a compliance that we assume it happens because it must happen. And if somebody isn't doing that and they want to sell in the market, they have to declare that we haven't done it. And then nobody will buy it. It'll be as simple as that. Nobody will buy it, including brands themselves.
Unfortunately, our time is at an end, but I want to say thanks first and foremost to you, Kevin and John. Thank you for all of the light you have shed on these issues. And they're just so difficult, but you both do a good job of telling us, yes, we can solve these and we have to solve these. And it's a matter of morality to know about the issues and to figure out how we're going to stop them. And none of us can afford simply to sit back and wait for someone else to take care of the problem. So I found your comments very inspiring, and thank you very much. I hope that everyone is excited about continuing this series, and our next program will take place on January 27th, 2021, when we'll address some different topics with respect to business accountability for human rights. And then next fall, we'll be back soon with the date. We're going to have a conference at the Columbus School of Law in Washington, D.C. And I know Kevin is already agreed to be our keynote speaker, and I'm hoping John is going to be there too. So we'll be sending out the details more in December. Meantime, if you have any ideas and you'd like to suggest future programs, or if we didn't get to your question and you'd like me to try to get an answer, then please email me. It's duggin@cua.edu, duggin@cua.edu. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody for being here. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks to all of the team who helped make this happen. Keep safe and well. Thanks so much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. And thank you, John.